Lida Citroën, welcome to the conversation today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
It is a true pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Denver, Colorado. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we will be talking about your book, The New Rules of Influence: How to Authentically Build Trust, Drive Change, and Make an Impact. I love everything about that. I think influence, of course, is so essential in this world, in all aspects of our lives, certainly within the workplace, within leadership roles that we may have. And this idea of trust. If we're going to drive change, if we're going to make an impact in any role that we have, whether at home, in the workplace, in our communities, in society, if we're going to do that, it's all built on trust. Trust drives change. Trust drives impact. It's what relationships are built upon, and relationships are what drive those things, right? Relationships are what drive influence. And so I'm super excited to unpack this and have this conversation with you today. As we get started, I wanted to share Lida's bio with everybody. Lida Citroën is the author of The New Rules of Influence and is an award-winning branding and reputation management expert who designs and enhances the identities of executives, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders globally. As CEO and founder of Lida 360, Citroën is sought after for her knowledge of personal brand development, reputation management, leadership communication, and online positioning. Lida, anything else you would like to highlight by way of your background or personal context before we dive on in?
I think what makes me a little different in this field is I spent 20 years in corporate branding. So the fundamentals of how we position and brand a company or a service or a product are what I bring into the personal branding space. So having that background, I think, is a little bit interesting. I'm also a LinkedIn learning instructor. And yes, I've authored 7 books. This is my latest one. And as a parent, you're never supposed to say there's a favorite child, but this one might be my favorite. And we'll talk more about that.
Wonderful, wonderful. One of the first questions I want to ask you is in relation to the book generally. I ask this usually of all authors. Books are labors of love. They take a lot of time and effort. Generally, authors, have very diverse backgrounds, and especially if you're not like a full-time author, like a trained, writer that's what you do your whole career. It's something that has a unique story. So I would be curious, like, why this book? Why now? What's kind of the backstory behind why this book came about?
Well, I love that question. Thank you, John. Most of my books have been business books, right? How to do something. I wrote a book called Control the Narrative, which is for executives to learn about positioning themselves. And it also includes a section on reputation repair, which is the only book on the market for individuals. I've written books for the military because that's a passion project of mine to help people know how to transition out of the military. And I've written one of my books is for people coming out of college that are looking at building their personal brand and jumpstarting their career. So I didn't necessarily want to write another business book. And I was approached by this publisher who said, why don't you write a book from your heart? And I thought,
Mhm.
well, they've all kind of come from my heart, but they've been how-to books, right? Or more
Yeah.
structured in business. And they said, write the book you think the world needs now. I mean, a small ask, right? And I started looking at patterns that I've seen over my 17 years of coaching executives and thought leaders and professionals in all sorts of industries in over 30 countries. And the one thing I keep running into is, how do we present ourselves? What is this executive presence model? And why does it not feel authentic? And that was such an interesting question I kept getting posed. So that really became the genesis of the book is executive presence, the way maybe you were taught, I know I was taught, still working? And is that what's driving influence today? And the more I got
Mhm.
into it, I realized it really isn't. We need to redefine this. It doesn't mean that, the classic books on executive presence and persuasion and influence, they still have a place in the world. But I think there's a lot of us who just never mapped towards it in a real
Yeah.
authentic way. So that was where the new rules of influence was born.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you kind of connecting it back to executive presence. I have to admit, I never loved the kind of the old approaches to this idea of executive presence, I just felt I just always felt like it was just so old school. So
It's like the Mad Men show, right? That's
yeah,
what.
100%. Thank
Yeah,
you. That's a perfect way to put it. That's the perfect way to put it.
yeah,
It's just so disconnected, so di a different generation, a different time and place. And maybe it worked back then, and I still even think for back then, there's just so much layered onto that I think is I would dare say even inappropriate. Like there's stuff that I just think is problematic and stereotypes and all sorts of things that I just think we need to get away from. And in this day and age, in this environment, in the modern world of work, I just don't think it holds up at all, really. And yet people still call to it and people still point to it all the time as being like this beacon of like what people should be doing, and I think it's tone deaf, and I just don't think it's real and appropriate. And so every time I hear someone point to it, I just cringe,
right.
and I find it frustrating. So I appreciate you challenging it, and I appreciate you providing something that is more up to date and useful for this time and place.
Well, and if you think about the pillars of executive presence, right? And I've taught executive presence. I feel a little embarrassed saying that. I've taught these pillars. It's you have to look a certain way, you have to sound a certain way, and you have to have gravitas.
Hmm.
And gravitas was always the one that tripped me up because, the research shows that HR leaders, executive leaders point to gravitas as an important ingredient in presence and influence and leadership. Yet, when asked to define it or teach it, we can't do that. So I'm like, well, that's not fair. We're saying you have to have this thing, but you'll know it when you see it, and we can't tell you how to get it. Right. And we have all these voices who don't fit the model, don't look like the poster child. So my question was, what are the rest of us going to do? I was brought up in a culture here in the corporate world in the US that you look a certain way, you sound, and then when it's your turn, you'll get tapped on the shoulder and you'll be able to speak, right? That's when you can have your influence. It's that old model of positional power, positional authority. I see this a lot coming out of the military, right?
Hmm.
The rank and status. If you're not at the big kids table, then you're supposed to sit in the back and be quiet until it's your turn. And there's a place for that. I'm not shooting decorum and professionalism down, but if the person in the back of the room who may not have a job title that starts with a C has something really interesting to say that changes the game? Like we
Right.
have to start asking that. And we also see at the same time this confusion of executive leaders who are trying to find their voice and their heart's in the right place, but they're not the right person to speak on that topic. And so
Mhm.
that's getting tripped up. And then you get into the whole, cancel culture thing. It all kind of comes together. We all want to be heard. We all want to know we matter, but how we get there has changed.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we're creating an environment where only a certain set of people are allowed to speak because of their position.
Right.
That's like
I think so.
insanity.
I think so. I think so because if you're trying to start a new initiative for an organization and human capital is humans, right? You're trying to start an initiative, you're going to do the research, you're going to get the data, but are you asking the people who live in the community that that initiative will be impacted by, right? Are you really getting in there? And then are you listening without judgment or are you listening to confirm your own biases? So that's what I talk about a lot in the book. And the book is not a hard read, right? It's very conversationally written. People who know me said they didn't know I could be funny. And there's funny parts in the book. And I'm like, I thought I was always funny. Um, but it's not an academic heavy lift because this doesn't
Yeah.
have to be. This is just, gritty, practical ways to start speaking up a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, wonderful. So, as we dive in further, I'd love to pick your brain on some of those elements that you think are just essential, like these pillars of starting to build trust. If we're going to develop these relationships, we
Right.
need trust, and that will help us to drive change, to make an impact. What are some of these pillars to building trust in this modern day and age, this modern environment?
Well, I think that question maps to kind of the structure of how I lay out my thinking, which is
Mm,
why do you want to build trust and have influence? Where's that
mm,
coming from? Because we have to know ourselves before we can expect someone else to know us. Who do you want to trust you and have influence? Who do you want to influence? Who are your people? And then we get to the how and the where. So that's kind of how I map my thought process around influence. And the first one, maybe the hardest, is to understand why. When we think of influence, oftentimes we think of influencers, right? People who are monetizing social media presence. But we have people who say, I've got this idea, this vision, this recommendation or solution that is just sitting on my heart and I want to bring it forward. It's not about money, it's not about fame, it's about doing the right thing, right? So you've got people like that who are really clear about their why. But then I say, okay, do you have the courage to build influence around that? Courage is the first rule in the new rules of influence because courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you're willing to work through it. And sometimes that person in the back of the room, the most terrifying thing you can say to them is raise your hand and challenge that position from the CEO or raise your hand and offer that idea. So it starts with courage and it includes things like being real. I talk a lot in the book about, we use this word authenticity. And I think we all use it without thinking, but authenticity is a tricky one for me. It's almost too popular. So I
mm.
use the word real. Because if I said,
Yeah,
John, be authentic with me, you'd be like, well, I kind of thought I was.
right.
But if I said, let's get real, or I'm going to be real with you, there's a different layer of understanding. And I think we have so overscripted our messages. We have so over sterilized our online presence and our bios and we've forgotten how to be real people. And real people are flawed and complicated and we got baggage and all this stuff, just like the people who are going to follow us. So when we can show some of that realness and curate relationships based on that, I think that is where trust actually can start. But one of the things I'm not a fan of is going as far as transparency.
Mm,
So I believe we should be real and genuine. If you ask me a question and I choose to answer, or I'm going to post something or make a comment, it should be my real view and opinion. But I don't have to tell you everything. And I think we've lost that idea. And so there's this obligation online and in person that if I'm going to stand in front of you, it's open game. And I don't believe in that. I also do reputation repair work, and I think a lot of people get into trouble when they overshare or they step into conversations they have no business being in just because they
mm.
want to be part of a trending topic. Um, so be real, be genuine, share from your heart, but know that you're allowed to create boundaries for yourself. I think influence today and building trust is also about understanding that not everybody's like us. And that's the challenge, but that's also where the beauty comes in. So the people I see building trust are people who are asking those questions and then just listening. I have an example of a client was telling me recently she was bringing a big new project to her team and she had worked on this, she'd curated it, she was so excited. And she brought it to the team expecting them all to be really excited and for the most part they were. But there was one person at the end of the table who said, "That doesn't really work for my community. And let me tell you why." And everybody in the room got quiet. They were like, uh-oh, what's going to happen? Is he going to get fired? Right? He just counteracted the boss. And the best thing my client said was, thank you. Thank you. Please tell me why this doesn't work for your community. And a great conversation was had. Doesn't mean you're going to change your view. It doesn't mean you're going to redo the project. It just means you're willing to consider and hopefully not miss something. So these are just some basic, basic tools to building influence and getting that trust. That is really the foundation.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think I like what you say about getting real, and about transparency. Like I'm a big believer within an organizational setting, like as a leader, as a leadership team, trying to be as appropriately transparent as possible with your team and with your people about policies, practices, procedures, about strategy, about those sorts of things. Recognizing that you can't be fully transparent about everything.
Right.
And so I always use that caveat, like be appropriately transparent, right? Um, and as leaders, we have to be real with our people, right?
Yeah.
And you were also talking about just personally, like what we're posting online, what we're sharing with other people. Do we overshare with people? And the reality is, yes, like people are
Hmm.
oversharing all the time. And if I'm going to like, sometimes we use the term like bring your whole authentic self to work.
Right.
Um, that doesn't mean burdening everyone with every last aspect of all of your baggage, right?
Yeah.
Which some people interpret that as. Like,
Exactly.
I don't want people to have to check everything about themselves and all their personal life at the door. Like, leave your personal life at home and then check it at the door and then come to work. We're not like the show Severance where you have
Right.
to like completely separate different aspects of your life. That's ridiculous, right?
Mhm.
But you also don't come to work and like overshare and dump all of your stuff on everyone at work. That's ridiculous too. So there has to be appropriate boundaries. There has to be like decorum. There has to be like um, yeah, there has to be a balance. And you can be real with each other, be genuine. You can recognize that yes, we all have our stuff. Yes, we all have messiness in our lives, but you don't have to overshare. Nobody has the bandwidth to take on and like be the therapist for everyone in their office and to have to take
Yeah.
on all the stuff for everyone around them when they have their own stuff, right? Um, but we can also have empathy for each other, and we can also like be there as like some level of support for each other without having to overshare, right?
Absolutely. And what I would advise is think about that ahead of time. So, I have guardrails around three topics, for instance, I typically don't go into. I don't talk about politics.
Mm,
Does not mean I don't have political views, but it's not part of my brand. I don't work with politicians. It's not my world, so I can keep that off to the side. I don't talk about alcohol and drugs. It's not part of the work that I do. And I have clients that are in recovery. So, out of sensitivity to them, and because it really isn't relevant, you don't see me photographed with alcohol. I don't talk or comment on posts or join conversations around that. And then the faith one is a big one. Now, if somebody wants to talk about faith, I will go there with them. But I have clients of all different backgrounds and cultures
right.
and faiths. So it isn't how I coach, it isn't how I speak through. So I can keep these boundaries in place, and it actually makes it easier to share and be real because I know where the line is for me. And as long as I keep myself safe, then I can have a lot of fun and share different sides of my personality. And the good thing about boundaries is you can always change them.
Yeah.
You have the right. I might decide one day that I want to talk about my favorite brand of Sauvignon Blanc. Whatever. I'm allowed to do that as a human being. But it's hard to do that in the moment. So thinking about it ahead of time. Some of my clients don't want to talk about the fact they have young children. That can either be there's perceptions that come with that, there's risk online that comes with that. I'm like, great, don't talk about it. You can talk about your family. You don't have to talk about the nuances. If you've got a spouse or a parent who's dealing with a health crisis, there's no social obligation to talk about that unless you want to. And it's all about being intentional and having that choice made ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Intentionality. I love that word.
Yep.
Intentionality is so important here. And You also mentioned the boundaries can shift, they can change. And the reality is, as you develop trust with those around you, they probably will change, right?
They could.
If I have a trusting relationship, mutual accountability and trust with people around me, and different levels of trust with people around me, yeah, I probably will share differently with those people, as I have different levels of trust. And that is normal, that is appropriate, and that's natural. Like I think we all tend to do that, right?
Right.
And so that makes perfect sense. And just to reiterate, I note the time we're nearing the end of our time. We're going to have to wrap up here in a minute, but just to reiterate, this idea of influence.
Mhm.
Um, we all know how important it is. I think many of us who aren't like naturally like super extroverted, outgoing, maybe you have this picture in your mind, like you said, you mentioned Mad Men, or you have this picture in your mind of like this commanding presence,
Right.
charismatic, like that executive presence. You may think, oh, I'm not that type of person to wield influence, or I'm not all about like power and influence, or like what's the Netflix show, the House of Cards, like
Oh,
political influence. Like you
right.
don't see yourself as like someone wielding that kind. Like we don't, it doesn't need to be like that, right? Like you
Right.
can have influence without position, power. You can wield influence through just being yourself,
Yeah.
through building trust in relationships, and being who you are, being real. And in fact, that is a very powerful form of influence. Um, you
There,
don't
there
need to be
are
someone who
others.
you're not.
Yeah, there are other steps I think that matter too, because just because you have passion doesn't mean you're the right person to take that message forward. So I don't want to send your listeners the wrong message that, it's just about being you, because there
Sure.
are protocols, there are processes, there are systems that we still have to work within. But they're not as complicated as I think sometimes we tell ourselves. And you mentioned the extrovert thing. Introverts have superpowers, absolute superpowers when it comes to influence. And I have so many examples of clients I've worked with who are not the most charismatic. I mean, they would say they have no gravitas, right? But boy, when they speak, it is so well put together and so thoughtful that the whole room comes to a stop. So it's not an extrovert introvert thing. It is very much about being consistent. It's very much about being real and truthful about who you are, but also knowing there's a right place and a right time to assert your influence. And thinking that ahead of time does make a difference. So I just wanted to jump in. Sorry to cut you off.
No, no, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Lita, this has just been a great conversation. Again, I know at the time I'm going to need to let you go here in a minute, but before we wrap things up, I wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, where they can find your book, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Sure. My website is lida360.com. The book, and we have a fabulous page about the book on Amazon, but it's being sold wherever books are sold. It's internationally doing really well. There's an audiobook, a Kindle, whatever format you'd like. And I'm pretty active on social media, so you can pretty much find me on all social media. The reason this book matters so much to me and this topic and what I'm starting to hear is there are a lot of people who have asked themselves that question. What if I'm meant to do more? What if I have something to say that changes everything, right? In my community, in my region, in my county, in my company. And those are the people that are starting to come forward. And it's a little bit of a slow burn, but when I get messages like that, I mean, my heart is just so happy because that's the person who I think we need to hear from. And the people who are leading those people need to know they're somewhere in the room. We have to find them.
Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. Lita, thank you so much. It's been a
Thank
pleasure. I
you.
encourage the
Thanks,
audience to
John.
reach out, to get connected, find out more about what Lita can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.